Chapter 8. Thursday late afternoon. Doreen looked at the tool and then at Mac. A what? He lifted it up and held it in his hand. This is an ice pick for ice fishing. It's an old-fashioned one, sturdier than the newer versions. Seriously? He nodded. We have ice fishing here. I never even thought about ice fishing. As a matter of fact, she couldn't think of anything worse. Why would you sit on the middle of a frozen lake with a hole in it to coax fish out? It's very popular, Mac said. At least it was when the lake froze over all the time, but it hasn't frozen over for quite a few years. I found this tool at the mouth of the river. He frowned at that. Not many people would fish at the mouth of a river, because the ice will never be as solid as it is farther down. But there have been years. He tilted his head, thinking about it. Honestly, if we talked to a couple old-timers, I'm sure we'd find some tales of years where they went ice fishing at the mouth. Maybe, Doreen said, studying the ice pick. Didn't I say an ice pick could be next? He glared at her. Nothing is suspicious about this. She pulled out the two little silver plates she had and held them up. This is the one Thaddeus found, and this is the one I found when I went back to the place Thaddeus showed me. Mac shook his head at that. Most people don't listen when a bird wants to show them a place. I've learned to listen. My animals have my well-being at heart. Not to mention they're as curious and as crazy as you are. He picked up a tag and placed it into the notch on the pick, and it sank in beautifully. Of course you can't guarantee this is the same piece. Doreen held up the other tag, but it was bigger. So that one won't fit this ice pick, he said. Maybe it went with an even bigger tool? Another ice pick, or something bigger? Is there a long-handled axe for ice work? Potentially. You have to gauge the hatchet size with its respective handle, so it doesn't damage the integrity of the wood. Doreen nodded as if she knew what he was talking about, but for her, it was just a tool. All that is rust on the head, right? Mac nodded, his gaze narrowing as he studied it. Was it along the riverbank, or up on the high part? Where the riprap wall and the loose rocks meet the property fence. He frowned. That riprap is often boosted, depending on the flooding. But at that section, I'm not sure any work's been done in a long time. So then our ice pick could have been buried here on purpose like a year ago, or Mother Nature could have buried it even as far back as 20 years ago. Exactly. He laid the ice pick down again and handed her the little metal piece. Hang on to this. Doreen did as he asked and then said, Is there any reason why? Well, he said, like you, I've learned to trust your animals. She gazed at him in delight. So, do you think the ice pick was involved in a murder? Immediately, his hands came up. Whoa. How did you jump from this little loose tag to our ice pick here being a murder weapon? She wrinkled her face up at him. Mostly because I'm involved, she admitted. Mac laughed. Just because you keep tripping into this stuff, he said, does not mean every tool you see, even as you thought or joked about it being an ice pick next, is a murder weapon. Of course not, Doreen said with a smile. You know my imagination runs away with me. You'll have to watch that. And besides, I'm certain this guy sold hundreds of tools. Sure, but then why would these two tags and this tool be back there near the lake? It wouldn't necessarily have anything to do with the actual maker, he said. It could have been left behind by one of his customers. Remember that. But Doreen didn't want to let it go. Maybe it's because I don't like the gardener, she announced. He looked at her in surprise and chuckled. If we looked at all the people you didn't like, we'd have nothing but issues with people. What do you mean, issues? She protested. I get along with everyone. He gave her a droll look. Except for all the people you put behind bars. If they hadn't been murderers or thieves or God only knows what other kind of lowlife, I wouldn't have had to, now would I? Mac wrapped an arm around her shoulders and led her back into the kitchen. How come you had coffee this afternoon and left half a pot? I don't know. I just forgot about it. What were you researching? His guess had been a little too accurate. She glared at him. He put his hands on his hips and tapped the floor. Okay, fine, she said. I was researching the carbuncles. Darbuncles, he corrected. She snickered. Can you imagine if that was your name? I don't imagine I'd like it, he said, but the fact of the matter is, it's their name. According to Nan, their parents disappeared, and so did their sister, she said triumphantly. Mac stopped, looked at her and said, Seriously? Nan said so, but Nan says lots of things. She is quite a character, Mac said sympathetically. And I do understand sometimes that she gets forgetful. You think? Doreen said with an eye roll. She watched as Mac poured the cold coffee into a pitcher. What are you doing? He just smiled and put the pitcher in the fridge. And then he proceeded to put on a fresh pot of coffee. You're chilling the coffee? Yes, and when it's cold, you just pour yourself a glass and add ice, and you have an iced coffee. She stared at him in delight. Oh my, I used to get fancy iced coffees at the coffee shop all the time. Are you telling me that they served me leftover coffee and charged me a fortune for it? Mac laughed. Probably not, but you can do it just as easily this way and doctor it up as you like it, with cream and sugar and flavorings. I see the pork chops are here but not quite thawed. He poked the top of one, and his finger indented it slightly. But almost. Yes, Doreen said, and then she turned back to him and asked, What do you know about the Darbuncles? Not much. Don't remember any time they've been brought in on a crime. Of course not. Speaking of crime, how is Steve? Steve is Steve, he said. Complaining madly. Of course he is, she said with a nod. He did murder all those people. At least he can't be much of a character reference when defending Penny anymore. Mac looked at her for a long moment. That's really bothering you, isn't it? Steve said Penny denied attacking me, and it would be my word against hers. She was an upstanding local citizen, and everybody trusted her, whereas I was nothing but an interfering interloper. She hated that her voice dropped sadly at the end, but honestly, it was a little depressing. You don't worry about Penny, Mac said. Remember, I was there. Sure, but people will say you're my friend and you can't be trusted. At that, his gaze narrowed. I can tell you, for one thing, that's not what people will say. Doreen frowned. Are you saying you are not my friend? She demanded. He groaned. Of course I'm your friend, but that's not what people will say. People are people, she said with a wave of her hand dismissing his argument. You know perfectly well they'll say anything they want to you to get out of trouble. Mac laughed. And I'm telling you that you'll be fine. At least Steve is in jail with Penny, she said with relish. So they're both in trouble now. They are indeed. And what about Crystal and that whole kidnapping mess? She asked. It's too early to tell. It's been turned over to the prosecutors, and it's up to them to figure out what they'll do. And remember, a lot of other missing children cases are potentially involved around Crystal's disappearance. Surely the brothers couldn't have taken them all down to Mexico, she said. That's what we're still trying to figure out, but every time we get something completed and off our desk, another case drops on the pile. You mean every time you try to solve one problem, I come along with another one? In this case, you did a great job, he said. Crystal is home. She's been accepted to university. She'll be just fine. At least she was loved on both sides of the border, Doreen said. It's got to make it a lot easier for her to understand. Exactly, Mac said with a big smile. He spied the zucchinis and said, "Now if only we had a grill." "If only we had a deck big enough for the grill," Doreen said. "I'll ask around the division if anybody has any leftover decking stuff. I know a couple buddies built new decks recently. Even if we can get a little bit, it'll help." "It will. It will help a lot." And with that, Doreen watched as Mac took the packaging off the pork chops and put them in the microwave to defrost, and then sliced the zucchinis to pop into a skillet. He reached into the fridge for the mushrooms and the fresh green onions, and before she knew it, he had the veggies in a pan ready to sauté together. "That already looks wonderful," she admitted, hearing her stomach screaming. "I had a sandwich a while back, but it seems like that was now hours ago, because I see this food and I want to eat now." "An appetite would be good," he said, "not to mention the fact that when you're resting and recovering like you have been, you need food to rebuild." "Says you," she said. "I find resting means I'm either not hungry or I'm really hungry." "Exactly, and you should be trying to regain your strength and healing. You were attacked again." "I'm not impressed with that." Doreen smiled at him. "Of course not, because once again you were trying to save me, and once again I was in trouble before you had a chance to even get there." "I sure wish you would just stay out of trouble," Mac muttered. When the microwave beeped, he sliced off the outside fat on the pork chops, added some spices, and while she watched, turned on the heat underneath a second skillet with a bit of the pork fat and fried the meat. "That looks absolutely delicious." Doreen studied the veggies and frowned. "I guess I should have accepted more zucchinis, huh?" "Does she have more?" "She had lots when I was there, but who knows now?" She shrugged and added, "We have some greens here. Do you want me to make a salad?" Mac nodded. "That would be good." Doreen washed the lettuce and tomatoes and sliced them up together to make a salad. By the time Mac was done with the pork chops and veggies, she had the salad ready and the outside table set. "Seriously hungry here," she said impatiently, as she studied the crispy golden tops of the chops. "I get that," Mac said, laughing. "Wow. I don't know how it happens, but every time you cook, it's like I haven't eaten in weeks." She rubbed her hands together as she eyed the food on the plate. He sat down beside her, smiled, and said, "It's okay. You can eat, you know." She grinned. "I can, but it's been a few days since I had a home-cooked meal." She picked up her knife and sliced into the pork. It was tender and moist and so flavorful that she sagged back as she chewed with her eyes closed. "That face," he said with a shake of his head. "Don't bother me," she said. "This is a Zen moment."